All right, hi there everyone. My name is Georgia Harrison and I'm really excited to share with you some information about lichens. I think they're really cool organisms and I hope you guys will leave the session today feeling like you learned more about these interesting creatures. So just to start out, I wanted to introduce myself a little bit more. My name is Georgia and I love working with lichens. I consider myself really more of an amateur still at this point, but I've done some research at the graduate level that pertain to lichens and taken some formal classes on them. I grew up in Southwest Michigan near Kalamazoo area, and I attended the Kalamazoo Nature Center as a kid for many years and eventually was on staff at the Nature Center camp there for many years. I worked with a ton of excellent people and loved getting to spend time outside and share environmental stewardship generally with staff and especially the campers. I attended Northern Michigan University in Marquette, where I did an undergrad capstone project on the impact of rock climbing on lichen communities in the Upper Peninsula. Then I continued on to do my master's at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, also on the impact of rock climbing on lichen communities, though a more well-developed project for my master's certainly. The photo shown here is me sampling rock climbing route in the Linville Gorge Wilderness area, which is where my research took place while I was in North Carolina. I finished up my master's in May of 2020, and I'm currently a first-year PhD student in plant sciences at the University of Idaho, working on a non-lichen related project. So lichens are kind of just for fun for me now, and I still love getting out to hike and see them all around, and hope I'll get to share with you some information about them. I am a rock climber, and so I always joke around that when I can't figure out how to get up a route, I just need to think like a lichen and get tough and strong and just stick to the rock like this. So this is my pitch to you, that when the rough gets tough, you just have to think like a lichen. What would a lichen do? So for this presentation, I'm going to briefly go over what is a lichen and a little bit of some simple ID characteristics, although lichen ID is its own separate beast, so we won't get too far into it. We'll then talk about lichens and their role in the greater ecosystem and how humans use them. And then I have kind of a lichen frequently asked questions session at the end that are definitely questions that I get asked a lot when I talk about lichens. So I hope that they'll be relevant to what you guys are wondering about, but I'm happy to answer any questions throughout the session or during questions period at the end. All right, so to start out, what is a lichen? A lichen is a symbiosis of at least 2, but up to 5 unrelated organisms. It's a combination of a photobiont, which is the photosynthesizing partner, and this can be an algae or a cyanobacteria. And the other partner is a fungus or a mycobiont, with myco meaning mushroom. And that's usually a ascomycete, but sometimes there's an additional basidiomycete, which are yeasts for lichens generally. So a cute way that I like to remember and talk about lichens are that Andy algae was a great cook, but roamed around and couldn't settle down, was living all around. And then Franny fungus was an excellent architect, but couldn't cook to save their life. And so Andy algae and Freddy fungus got together. Franny, the fungus, provides the structure and the support, and Andy algae provides the cooking. So the cyanobacteria or the algae are what are actually going through photosynthesis. So remember, or I guess recall, that mushrooms are heterotrophs, so they don't make their own sugars. And so they have to get their sugar from somewhere. And in this case, these fungi are obligate lichenized species, so they have to be in a lichen partnership in order to exist. And so they need the algae present in order to produce some sugars and for them to grow. All of those members take place in different layers in the lichen, and I like to think of all these layers as kind of representing different function in the organism overall. So the upper cortex is kind of the upper layer, the outside. Then there's usually an algal layer directly under that, that sometimes sort of shines through, like when you see a really bright green lichen when it's wet out or just after rain, that's the algae directly shining through. In the upper cortex, conversely, when it's really dry out and maybe super sunny, can be all these different cool colors that sort of protect the algae and give it a nice home to hang out in. The medulla, which is the middle, is mostly fungal hyphae, and that's a place for the algae to hang out. It provides a moist, nice environment for these algae. And all the algae species that occur in lichens could live by themselves if they wanted to, but in this case, they're part of a lichen. Sometimes people describe lichen as fungi that have discovered farming. So they're sort of farming the algae, but holding them inside of them, I guess. Then the lower cortex similarly is the lower border, and then lichens have rhizines, which are just like attachment structures to whatever their substrate is. They're not roots or anything like that. They don't pull up water or nutrients. They just attach it. Sometimes really well, sometimes not so good. So in terms of function, we can think, where is the sugar being produced? The algae. Algae are the only thing in this organism producing sugar through photosynthesis. And where is the sugar consumed? Well, the algae has to consume a little bit of sugar to live, but most of the sugar is being consumed by the fungal component, which is all of the rest of the organism. And you can also conversely think of it as who's providing the structure, and that would be the fungus in this case. And the algae is just kind of chilling, kind of locked in, just doing its thing. When it rains, it gets wet, hangs out, makes sugar. When it's not rained, dries out, it's casual. All right, so a brief history of lichens. Originally, scientists thought that lichens were plants. Actually, Linnaeus classified a handful of lichen genera and species, but he classified them into kingdom Plantae. Eventually, a Swiss botanist revealed that they were composite organisms, which was just groundbreaking information. And the scientific community thought, what? This can't be true. This partnerships don't fit into clear boxes, and we still don't have a great way to classify lichens, to be honest. They're kind of like the unwanted stepchild of the fungi world, but they're technically still classified within them. So they're just sort of this funky gray ground between fungi and plants that sometimes just kind of get left out, and that's a bummer to me. But they are really cool organisms that are worth studying and knowing about in their own right. So algae in the cyanobacteria, remember, are using the sunlight to make nutrients, but the fungus in turn is providing structure, water, nutrients, and anchor to this environment, and really allowing the algae to exist in an area that it normally wouldn't be able to get to. Because when these algae and cyanobacteria are free living in the environment, they're pretty limited in that they have to live in really moist areas. Whereas other areas that lichens can live, like the tops of trees or the sides of cliffs, are not necessarily that moist, and the algae or cyanobacteria would not be able to grow there by itself. So a lot of people use lichen as the perfect symbiosis relationship. It's kind of the classical example in all of your introductory biology. It is a great relationship. It's definitely mutual in some ways, but remember that the algae could be free living if they were outside of the lichen. And so it's not a true symbiosis in that they both don't really need each other, but it is some symbiosis in the way that they're both getting something out. Each partner is getting something out of the relationship and not it's not parasitizing it or anything like that. Okay, so just to talk about a little bit about all the different components that can go into a lichen. So here you can see the different types of cells in a bryoria, which is a witch's hair lichen. It looks like witch's hair. It's like brown and stringy. It doesn't grow as much in the Midwest, but it's more in the Pacific Northwest. But you can see that in this picture, the green are yeast, Basidiomycetes, the blue are fungi, and the red are algae. So another big step in the history of how lichens have been studied is this revelation that it's more than one fungi partner. So the Ascomycete is usually like the main fungal partner, but then there's like a little bit of yeast in there that sort of makes it all work, I guess. And so this was a big deal. Happened within the past decade and really changed how scientists treat and look at lichens and how they appreciate their diversity. And this research came out of Canada, and it was mostly based that people can't figure out how to grow lichens in the lab. They have all of the components and parts of what they think should work, but they can never get it to live. And we figured out that what's missing was the yeast. So we know that the yeast is kind of adding a little extra secret spice to the mix that's making it all work together at this composite organism. So they're definitely very complex and totally way more left to be learned about them. So let's dive in a little bit about how to categorize and maybe think about IDing these lichens. So broadly, we group lichens by their growth form, and those are usually crustose, foliose, and fruticose lichens. So, and sometimes squamulose, depends on who you ask, I guess. So crustose lichens are those which are like directly applied to their substrate. I always teach it to people that it's almost like it's spray painted on there. Like you can't get this lichen off without taking part of the substrate with it. Like you'd have to chisel it off. And you usually see these on tree bark or on rock faces, things like that. Squamulose are usually a little bit bumpier. They're like, they're little flakes. They have a distinct upper and lower layer, whereas crustose have no lower layer. It's like directly attached to their substrate. Foliose are leafier lichens. They also have a distinct upper cortex and lower cortex, usually that are different colors. And fruticose are like shrub-like lichens. Sometimes they're bushy almost, and they're the same color all around, and they almost look like little tubes usually. And so these categories are helpful for classifications. If you're ever looking at resources online or in ID books, usually this is how lichens are broken up. But it's important noting that these are just distinctions that humans put around these lichen, the box that we want to put the lichens into. It doesn't have really any consequences for their actual species identity or what fungal partner it is. I'll talk more about that later, I guess, too. So here's an example of the 3 main growth forms of lichen all in one space. So you can see that the crustose lichen is kind of directly adhered to the bark. It's got those dots with lines around it are actually sexual reproduction structures called apothecia. You can see it's kind of got distinct borders, the black wall around it, and that's because lichens are fighting with each other, having a territory dispute. You can also see some foliose lichen, the green flakier lichen that has the black little hair-like things sticking out from it. And then you can see some fruticose lichen, the Usnea species, which is an old man's beard, and it's kind of that bushier, almost, I don't know, I think it looks like an alien, something that would live on an alien planet, shrub-like green one there. And you can see it's all the same color all around. All right, so let's just talk briefly about some identification basics for lichens. But first off, identifying lichens, not easy. They are morphologically really variable. The terminology is so weird. It's intimidating, honestly. I'm still intimidated by it. It's not like any other terminology in botany. It feels like made up space words that someone just said, this is it. I'm going to use it to describe a lichen. So it's very tricky. Many of the characteristics can be microscopic and require dissection. And some of the key characteristics have to do with chemical compounds that the fungal partner produces. And lichens are not super well understood. So it's hard to find good resources, though there are certainly some out there. So to start out with some crustose species, here are a few of my favorites. It's a smoky eye boulder lichen. You can see that it's apothecia, which are the dots that are kind of outlined in black. Those are the sexual reproduction structures. And the thallus, which is like the main body of a lichen. Think of it as, so that's the part that's outlined. It's like the main green. And so this is pretty common in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And when it's wet, the thallus is like bright green to blue, and the apothecia just pop, and it looks like someone's wearing eyeliner and pretty eyeshadow. So lichen names can be fun too. Okay, here's a few other examples of some different crustose lichens. This is a lichen101 species. It has a solid discs on the apothecia. Crustose ID is honestly really tricky, and I still don't feel great about it, so don't take too much of this to heart. There is a type of crustose lichens called script lichens, in which their apothecia are folded in on themselves, making these little scribble-looking things that are actually their reproductive parts. And so this is a script lichen with the genus is Graphis. Okay, now getting into some foliose lichens. Foliose is definitely the largest and most broad category of lichens, and sometimes they all really look pretty similar. So their ID characteristics can sometimes be hard to tease out, but I find once I get used to lichens in my area, they're a little bit easier to sort out. So this is a parmelia, which is a type of shield lichen. It has rounded lobes at the end, and it has kind of, you can see how it turns a little bit brown towards those lobe tips. So that's a key characteristic for this genera. Okay, here's another parmelia. Also lobed, also green. They're usually called green shield or just shield lichens in general. Here's another cool foliose lichen. This is one of my favorites, Slobaria pulmonaria, which is the common name is lung lichen because it looks, it has the structure of a lung, and it's been used as medicinal properties to heal pulmonary issues. They are also really good indicators of healthy, well-established forests. And I have more pictures of lung lichen later on. Gymnoderma lineara, this is rock gnome lichen, which is actually a federally endangered lichen species found in the Southern Appalachian Mountains. And rock tripe lichen, which they're umbilicate foliose lichens, and so they have an umbilicus, which is like a belly button that attaches them in this big flake, usually to rocks. And so I think they're really cool. They're super funky, and when they get wet, they're really soft and sloppy, I guess, and soft, but they have this umbilicus that keeps them closely attached to the rock. Okay, let's get into some of the squamulose lichens. So squamulose lichens are also called two-part lichens. So they have squamules, which are the little flakes on the bottom of this picture, and then they have podetia, which are the stalks. In this case, they're cups. So this is Cladonia fibrida. Cladonia is one of the biggest genera of lichens. It's all of the pixie cup lichens or British soldier type lichens you guys might be more familiar with. On the top, this is a picture of the British soldier lichen. The stalk, which is the podetia, is just an extension of the fruiting body. Here's another Cladonia species. In this case, it doesn't have a cup at the end, it's just a single stalk with the spores being at the tip of that stalk. Okay, and now fruticose lichens for the last group. So remember that fruticose lichens are bush and shrub-like, and they can be erect or kind of hanging, but they don't have distinct upper and lower surfaces. They're the same color and texture all around. So this is an example of a wolf lichen. Here's an Auvernia, which is a antler lichen. Each kind of component looks like a smushed antler. It's hard to describe without being in person with you guys, but it's flattened and light green and kind of branches frequently like antlers. And another common fruticose lichen is usnea, which are old man's beard is their common name, and they'll grow really big and green in this color, and they look like a beard. So just to review those different groups I talked about and how it relates to the layers of the lichen partners. So on the left, you have what a foliose lichen layers look like, which was the original example I showed you. But in fruticose lichens, they have no lower cortex. It's just one outer cortex kind of surrounding everything, and there's an inner cord, and the algae, cyanobacteria are still lining that outer cortex. And then with crustose lichens, which are the lower photo on the right-hand side, those have a distinct upper cortex, but no lower cortex. The medulla is directly attached to the substrate, which is why you can't peel or flake the crustose off. Lichens grow on all different types of substrate, including bark, soil, rock, bryophytes, and even other lichens. So they grow pretty much everywhere. I'll show you a few pictures of some different ones, but I'm sure you guys have all seen lichen around, but I challenge you to just go look outside for 5 minutes and see how many different you can find, maybe living on different substances. You'd be surprised. So here's a good example of lichens living on bark. And we see lichens living on the ground. So this is reindeer lichen, a cladina species, and it's living directly on the soil. It's very bushy. Here's some lichens living on bark or directly on the mosses that are present. And you even have lichen that grow on other lichens sometimes, if soil is able to accumulate, or they just even can grow directly on the lichen. And it's called lichenicolous, which is hilarious. But all different types of substrate, they're pretty much everywhere. They're found on every continent. There's nothing holding them back. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about lichens in the broader ecosystem and the role that they play. I find when I talk about my research with lichens or just my general interest in them, people are like, so what? Why do I care about lichens? Why are they cool? Other than the fact that you like them a lot. And they have a lot of great functions in the ecosystem other than just being a diverse and worthy living thing of conserving. So my research that I've done has focused on lichens as a part of an ecosystem, specifically cliff face ecosystems. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but just generally the role that they play. One of the biggest role that lichens play, especially in northern latitudes, is that they provide food for caribou and other wildlife during the winter when other vascular plants aren't present. And so it kind of gets the caribou and other things through the winter, which is obviously very important. And in Arctic areas and like subarctic areas, lichens can be the primary producers or the main thing that's making sugar and producing life. And that's the base of many ecosystems. So for starters, they play a crucial role in northern areas. Additionally, lichens are key members of early ecological succession. So ecological succession is the transition from bare rock or a landscape that's been ripped up to kind of a healthy, diverse ecosystem, maybe one that has a forest on it, maybe one that has other plants and other things that's able to support wildlife. And there's many steps that go on, but an important first step is just some sort of life other than the bare rock usually. And that can be lichens in many cases. So it can take a long time and it's a slow process, but crustose lichens are often able to move in first and hold their ground, so to speak, and start accumulating nutrients and holding it on the system. And then maybe more crustose or foliose lichens can grow over that lichen, and eventually you're able to accumulate nutrients in soil. And this is the case on many cliffs where these ledges and other features are the main kind of location where life happens, but plants need soil and water in order to grow, and lichens and mosses can kind of be that first step in getting things going from just the bare rock. So I think of it as kind of like a rough job that lichen are willing to do for the greater ecosystem. They can just tough it out, and slow and steady wins the race for lichen in ecological succession. They're going nowhere fast. Right? Lichens are also really important for maintaining nutrients and moisture in ecosystems, particularly in forest canopies. So lichens contain many biologically important nutrients, and they're able to hold that up in the forest canopy when normally plants would kind of lose some of those nutrients and maybe photosynthase after it rains and they get leached out of the system. But lichens are able to hold on to it and maybe hold on to it through periods where it's more needed as an input, and it just kind of creates more heterogeneity in how ecosystems run. It's an important mix. All right, and now I want to talk about how humans can use lichens. This is kind of a brief outline, and I'd be happy to talk to you guys more about it if there's any of these that you're interested in. My information on this is a little bit more limited than the ecological component, but first off, humans have used lichens as famine food. This is particularly in northern climates. I've never eaten a lichen, and I don't really have any any pressing plans to do so, but I have friends who have, and they said it's kind of okay, it's not great. I think that mostly lichens are used as famine food, that kind of a filler and better than nothing. Oftentimes it's umbilicaria or kind of those leafier foliose lichens that have a little bit more like meat to them. I don't know, you have to boil them for a while and usually pour off the water because it can have secondary chemicals that the lichens produce, which can be toxic. So kind of like a mushroom soup, miso sort of deal. Native Americans used lichens. They would use it kind of in soups and broths like I talked about, but also they would ferment it and also add sugars and other like natural sugars to it to make kind of cake-like substances. So sort of as like a structural part of a diet. Like I said, I haven't eaten them, but it would certainly be better than starving. I'll give them that. Some humans use lichens for medicinal properties. One common example of this are usnea, which are the old man's beard lichen, especially in the southern Appalachian Mountains around the Blue Ridge. They do have antibacterial properties. Many lichens have interesting properties of their like secondary chemicals that the fungi component produces, and they have been shown to kill bad bacteria. So people will make tinctures out of this lichen and use. I haven't, again, lichens are out and they're growing for a long time in the environment, and things bioaccumulate. So kind of definitely pluses and minuses. Lichens are excellent air quality indicators, though. The Forest Service and many other agencies use lichens growing on trees as indicators of how good the air is. You can see that there's kind of a sliding scale. It definitely depends on the area you're in. But usually the usneas and other like bigger leafy ones grow in areas with limited pollution and more developed later successional, healthy, high nutrient ecosystems like older growth forests, whereas some other lichens indicate poorer air quality and they're more tolerant to pollutants in the air. Lichens can also be used to age things through the art of I don't know how to say this one, lichenometry. Lichen words are so tricky, but people have used lichens usually during the period of time of history where like after radioactive carbon dating becomes a little bit less reliable. You can use lichens. There's a few crustose species in particular that are shown that grow at really consistent rates that like a few millimeters a year. And so you can measure their size. People will use this to date headstones in particular and some other like man-made structures to figure out how long they've been out. And my favorite way to use lichens is as a natural dye for fibers. I knit and spin more than the average grandma, a lot. And so there's a bunch of cool ways you can use so many different lichens as a dye product. And just like with other natural dye components, I only harvest kind of wind-fallen lichens that usually I go out after a storm, things that have blown down out of the tops of trees or just naturally fallen off. I would never go out and pick and harvest, just pull a lichen off of the substrate. But there's two main techniques for lichen dyeing. There's the boiling water method, and then there's a fermentation and extraction method that's required for some. So on the top is actually, I dyed this a few weeks ago. It was super fun. This is wolf lichen, pretty common in the Pacific Northwest, and I boiled it for a few hours and I was able to get a nice soft green color with this alpaca wool. I was pretty excited about. I've also done some ammonia extraction with different umbilicaria or rock tripe species. That you have to ferment it in ammonia for like 4 to 6 to many more months, but you get this super awesome magenta purple color that is really cool, and I think harder to find in other natural dyes. So natural dyeing with lichens is super cool. There's a natural dyeing with lichens book that I would totally recommend. It's the only natural dyeing with lichens book out there. And there's also really good Facebook groups for it if you guys are ever interested, or if you have any other questions, I'd be happy to talk to you about it. But super cool use. And also lichens have a lot of kind of secondary chemicals in them, so you don't have to mordant the wool, like get it it just sticks to the wool better by itself. You don't have to add any additional chemicals to it normally. All right, and then briefly I'm going to run through some frequently asked questions or things that I get asked a lot about lichens. All right, how many lichens are there out there? Well, a lot, and growing more every day. We're learning more about lichens all the time. New species are being discovered basically by anyone who looks really hard and gets really into IDing. There's totally species out there to be known. There's 3,600 species in North America, but around 7,000 worldwide. Lichens represent about 20% of fungal diversity. So just lichens are classified by their fungal partner. And so around 20% of fungal species are required to be in a lichenized relationship. And so it's a wide diversity of fungi, but it is worth noting that the photobiont, the algae and the cyanobacteria are more generalist. There's only about 40 genera that are involved in lichen relationships, and it's easier to mix around with the algae. They're not as specific. All right, what's the difference between a moss and a lichen? Well, or other cool green stuff you see around? Well, we know that lichens have layers and they have a distinct upper and lower color, and lichens contain fungi and algae, whereas moss are free-living, simple plants that are completely photosynthetic. There are definitely some lichen that look green, like almost like a plant, but I do think it's kind of a different green, and there's a different tint to it. And also, if you get it wet, one feels more like a leaf and one feels more like a squishy mushroom to me. All right, how do lichens reproduce? Well, the fungi runs the show. So the fungi is really the only thing that's getting to reproduce, although lichens can produce sexually or asexually. When producing asexually, they're basically sending off a little bundle of the photobiont and the mycobiont to go off and spread. But when they produce sexually, it's just the fungal spores that spread, and they're just hoping to meet the right algae along the way. So there are several different types of lichen reproductive structures and just ways to distribute their spore, including apothecia or conidia and pycnidia. Again, weird made up words, but sexually and asexually, and a lot of times the cool funky parts that you see of a lichen are the sexual reproductive structures. Do lichens have a growing season? No, not really. Lichens are more controlled by having a suitable climate that they can work within, and having sun so that the algae can go through photosynthesis, and then being moist. So lichens can go dormant if they're dried out, but when they're re-wetted, it could be with just fog or it could be with a heavy rainpour. It's variable. They're able to kind of re-up themselves. And so they don't have like a whole growing summer season or anything like that. It's more variable. It can even change day to day what hours they're active. Do lichens hurt their substrate? Do they hurt the tree bark, or do they hurt the rocks that they're on? And a little in the way that they're growing on something and they're blocking it. Particularly crustose lichens that grow on a rock, have parts of their medulla, which are the middle part, that kind of reach down and release secondary chemicals that are meant to expand slowly and create these little teeny tiny microfractures in the rock face. So they're not, chipping off large components, but they're just like slowly expanding and spreading their medulla throughout. Are there endangered lichens? Yep, there are a few. The most familiar one that I'm familiar with is rock gnome lichen, which is Gymnoderma lineara. It's federally endangered, ranked at the G2 level, and it's really common at high elevation, moist areas in the southern Appalachian Mountains. There are a few other endangered lichens, although it's hard to know lichen distribution because they're just not as well known as a lot of other organisms. And so there are definitely a lot of other rare lichens that are not maybe appreciated for their rareness yet, that are still yet to be better understood. Why so many cool colors for lichens? Well, it can be two main reasons. The first is sunscreen or sun protection for when lichens living on the bare rock. And then the second is sometimes the photobiont, particularly the cyanobacteria, gets to shine through. So on the bottom left, you can see a lobaria species where it's like dark green and it's like this nice rich green, and that's actually the cyanobacteria shining through and giving that color. And so sometimes it comes from the algae, sometimes it's the fungi protecting the algae with different, like a sunscreen layer. All right, and finally, did you just become a new fan of lichens? I hope so. I'm happy to share with you guys some resources. The Brodo is like one of the fathers of lichenology. So lichen.com is his website, has some good resources. The Ways of Enlightenment, pun intended, is another good source. Tim Wheeler does extensive photography of lichens and has this really cool series of taking photos with lichens dry and then wet and showing the differences, how they kind of come to life and change colors, and they're really cool. I love looking at lichens, especially after a rain. And finally, I would be happy to talk to you guys whenever about lichens. There's my email down there, gharrison@uidaho.edu. I'll be happy to answer any questions or anything like that in the chat. And it's been a great opportunity to talk to you guys. And yeah, thank you.